I want to offer you all an official welcome on behalf of the African Studies Center here, and to thank Adil for not only organizing this conference, but also for really taking on Africa as one of the important issues and thinking about the future, because I think one of the things we've been talking about throughout it so far is the degree to which Africa is ordinarily viewed as just a place to be helped and not a place with a future. And so I think what we're trying to talk about today, even as we debate sometimes heatedly, is what that future should be, and a realization that there actually are many possible routes that Africa can go down. You have in your folders already the biographies of all of these people, so I don't want to go into to repeat what's there. That's one of my real annoyances at conferences, when people read what's written there. But I want to mention a couple of things about our panelists. Robert Rotberg is really one of the deans of the study of African politics. I know, as someone who teaches a variety of courses on African politics, that his writings have often appeared in the syllabi for what I teach. So he's someone who has been in this area for some time and has been on this campus many times. So we're glad to welcome him back. Abdul Paliwala has worked in many parts of the world, but what I want to mention about him today, for you to keep in mind, is that BU is starting a new partnership with Warwick University in the United Kingdom. And he is here in part to speak for this conference, but also in part to help get that partnership going. We envision it, well, we're still really thinking about what it's going to look like, but we imagine student exchanges, faculty exchanges, conferences that will be shared on subjects like this. So if you have any ideas for that, please speak to either me or Professor Paliwala. And finally, if you could not find the biography of our last speaker, Professor Oyewumi, it's on the very last page, so it's not alphabetically. And the reason it's not alphabetical is because she was very gracious at the last minute, about this time last week, when we had a cancellation of a speaker who was coming from Uganda. I asked around, well, who would be somebody who might get good discussions going? And it was suggested that, yes, well, no, I've heard that Professor Oyewumi is an expert on gender issues and has a book that I believe has been very widely discussed. And so we're very, very pleased that she was willing to come at the last minute, but also think that this is a wonderful opportunity for conversation. So I'm not going to take more time so that we can have our speakers all take full time. Because this is dealing with political issues and institutions, and there is some familiarity with authoritarianism in Africa, I'm going to practice that in my timekeeping. I want to warn the panel. So we're going to try to stick to 15 minutes, largely because the discussions here are great. So I want to have a chance for the people in the audience to respond and to argue. So we'll give you each 15 minutes, and I'll try to give you a couple minutes warning in advance. So, Professor Rotberg.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome to a gorgeous spring day in Boston. As the Pardee Center suggests, the study of the future is important, and the study of the long-range future is very important for Africa, because the long-range future in Africa is now. And we can look at it. Now, the caveat in all these discussions, I'm sure earlier speakers have mentioned it, but one of the fallacies of arranging conferences on Africa is that there is no one Africa. There are many Africas. We've known that over the years. The ambassador wisely spoke very well of Southern Africa, but there are other parts of Africa that function less well than Southern Africa. He helped preside over it for a time, which is why it's so well run. Now, I think in limited time that we should, I'm going to focus certainly, and we should focus, I think, always on the two critical elements in Africa's current time and its future. There are no more important, I want to emphasize this to be provocative, there are no more important issues than leadership and governance. Everything in Africa, everything in most parts of the developing world, but certainly in Africa, depends on leadership and governance. Leadership is much more important in Africa, as in all areas with fragile societies. It's much more important. The smaller, the least prosperous the society, the more, and it's usually men, the more the big man has a very important role. And leadership, part of the good news of Africa, part of the good news out of Africa is leadership is getting better. There are more Botswanas, there are more Mauritiuses, there are more Mandela-like parts of Africa, even if South Africa has shifted away from the legacy of Mandela severely. Ghana is a poster child for success. The post-Rawlings era has been really exemplary in terms of positive leadership. And we could name 6 to 10 places that are dramatically better led than they were a decade ago and two decades ago. Just a quick word on what I mean by responsible leadership. Responsible leaders have a vision which is a vision for an entire country, a set of peoples which is not divisive, which is inclusive, and are able to mobilize their followers, the whole country preferably, to support a vision which brings the nation state forward. That used to be called 30 and 40 years ago nation building. But now leadership is really the critical component of nation building. If we look distant from Africa, Singapore was created out of a pirate swamp in 1965 at a time when Ghana and Nigeria, on a per capita basis, were 3 or 4 times more prosperous than Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. Now, Singapore is at least 25 times more prosperous than Ghana, Nigeria, and many other African countries. If one looks at GDP per capita for Africa as a whole, one sees really the persistence of poverty of a kind that doesn't exist in Asia any longer. The difference, of course, is leadership plus governance. And I want to give you very quickly a sketchy paradigm. Leadership begets good governance. Good governance begets a political culture of participation and a democracy. And a political culture of democracy begets political institutions capable of sustaining the nation state forward. That's what has happened dramatically in those countries in Africa that have moved forward and with good leadership created good governance and has led to prosperity, jobs, and therefore the absence of poverty for the most part. And I'll talk about some of the key countries in a minute, but the good news is this paradigm is more widely appreciated and more widely being emulated. And I'll give some precise examples in a half a moment. The examples of countries which are well-led and well-governed are those places which are the most prosperous per capita in Africa. It's quite clear that good governance goes along with the absence or the reduction of poverty. And it permits, as the questioners and the ambassador talked about earlier, it permits the beginning of a robust educational system, good health outcomes, and so on. There's causal relationships and heavy correlation, which we can examine if you want in the question period. The the absence, there is prosperity and great absence of conflict in the well-governed states. Now, what do we mean by well-governed? I've put forward a theory that governance is the performance of governments for their people. And it can be divided into 5 major categories that are obvious categories, but need to be spelled out: safety and security, rule of law and transparency; 3rd, participation and respect for human rights; 4th, sustainable economic development; and 5th, human development. Now, in the Index of African Governance and in the other work I've done, we use 57 subcategories to quantify the success in those five major categories. And in the last iteration of Strengthening African Governance, the Index of African Governance, the 10 best governed countries according to this matrix in order were Mauritius, Seychelles, Cape Verde, Botswana, Tunisia, this is the entire continent, Tunisia, Ghana, Algeria, Namibia 8th, South Africa 9th, San Tome and 10th, Gabon 11th, and so on. That's instructive, and most of you here could have come up with the top 10 or 11 just by thinking about the problem, and you wouldn't have had to measure a great deal, nor would you have to measure a great deal to go from, let's say, 41, Equatorial Guinea, to 42, Swaziland, and on down the list, Congo, Brazzaville, Guinea, Zimbabwe, Angola, Eritrea, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, the DRC, Chad, Sudan, and Somalia. Somalia doesn't count because there isn't a government there except in the unrecognized Somaliland, which should be recognized. That's a different subject. I want to throw that out. Now, but what's interesting about governance and measuring governance, and the good news in Africa really can be examined between, let's say, 10 and 28, the way in which countries are moving up and down. What's Malawi 14th, Senegal 16th, Lesotho 23rd, Zambia 24th, Rwanda 26th, Kenya 27th, and Uganda 28th. Now, there's some lag in these numbers, of course, but what's interesting is that one can show that there is and has been better governance over the years from 2000 to 2009, where we've produced the index and numbers. There's distinct improvement in the way in which countries are governed, and there's distinct greater interest in the countries about how to improve. And I tout the index not as a ranking system, which doesn't really matter a whole lot, but as a diagnostic service which can be used to show the good news in Africa and highlight those areas where progress is being made and highlight those areas where progress can be made most easily and with the best return on investment. Let's talk about very quickly some other areas of good news. Elections are much more honest and less rigged in most of Africa today. Changes of regime are usually at the ballot box, even though it's fraught with enormous problems. The notion that the southern Sudan might secede through an election is really magnificent progress, if it happens or even if it doesn't happen. And now this is right at the cusp of the returns on this election in the Sudan, which is probably a flawed election, but we don't precisely know that yet. But even so, the fact that the Southerners have organized elections for themselves in the South may augur well. I'm not completely sure of that. The other good news and the reason, responding to a question that was asked the ambassador earlier, two of the reasons that Africa is showing much more good news and making progress is that Africa is much more a part of the world global village. It's really much better integrated than it was. And even more importantly, in my view, in the last 20 years, we've had an enormous resurgence of the African middle class. Africa, forgive this word, but Africa is very much more bourgeois than it was. And that is a pressure, an interest group, which pressures all parts of Africa. The infrastructure is improving in parts, not in Congo, but in many other areas. The media is freer than it used to be. The spread of mobile phones, cell phones, has been enormously important and critical to the future, particularly after the Kenyan troubles, which was demonstrated then, and will be in the future. The Africans are much more connected to their own markets, to their own parts of the politics, and is much more able to bring pressure. Now, just because I only have a minute, probably. 2 minutes, wow. There are areas of Africa which cannot come under the heading of good news. There are still a few places with hardcore authoritarians at their rule. Zimbabwe is the obvious poster child for venality in Africa. And the interesting thing about Zimbabwe, several interesting things, is that the destruction of Zimbabwe by Mugabe can be traced in numbers. And we can look at all the obvious numbers, including infant mortality and life expectancy, and show how Zimbabwe has collapsed from 800 GDP in 1998 to 150 GDP now, from 40% unemployment to 90% unemployment, from 14 million people in Zimbabwe to 10 million now, 3 million having fled, 1 million having been killed, and so on and so on. I won't belabor the point. But our other big issue, which we must, all of us who care for Africa, look at very, very closely, is Nigeria. Nigeria is large. Nigeria has all the problems that Africa has always had, and more. And if we can't get Nigeria right for Africa, the ability to build on the good news that I've talked about will be very, very difficult. Thank you.
Professor Paliwala.
Thank you. It is a privilege to follow Bob Rothberg, but in the words of Monty Python, here's something completely different. But first, I would like to thank Adil and the Pardee Center for inviting me here. It is a great pleasure to me that our two universities are so interested in Africa, and it bodes well for the future. What I'm going to discuss is a project which was initiated and led by my Malawian colleagues, particularly Professor Garton Kamchitsera. And in a sense, and it was an investigation of how do we measure justice. It was funded by the EU, and it is still funded by the EU just. But that really brings me to the first point. What is the good news? And to me, the good news is the people. The fact that Africans like Garton, but also people like Mudimbe, Shivji, Mamdani, Peter, I could name a lot. They are taking command intellectually. And some of you here, of course. To me, that's the good news, because that's the future, the intellectual future. The second good news is the ordinary people. I'm going to talk in a little while about this little, what they call it, club, but it's a victim support group in Malawi. To me, that is also the good news. People taking control over their own lives instead of relying on others. Thanks. So when we started looking at the indicators, the first thought we had is, are indicators part of the good news? And then the second thought was, should the indicators be about measuring justice, or should they be about measuring injustice? Because one way of looking at it is the ways in which global and national governance agencies and institutions, corporations, use law and other governance means to promote injustice. Should we be measuring that? Thank you. The third thought we had, obviously, was about, terrible word, indicatorology. At the Kennedy School's organized recent conference, one of the conclusions of the participants was that the world today is swimming in indicators of justice, safety, and the rule of law. But the critique was that apart from the sea, these tended to be expert-led with emphasis on rules and activities and not on people and experiences. The question is, have things changed? Are they changing? Etc. We also considered Stephen Morse's injunctions on indicatorology. Sorry. He says the power held by those wielding indicators is rarely acknowledged, and instead the processes of creation and use are presented in benign, technical, and of course, objective language. Thanks. I do not have time to discuss in detail this sea of indicators. What we see is a variety of indicators from the UNDP's Human Development Index to good governance indices used by the World Bank, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, to rule of law indices, to performance of judicial and legal institutions, to diagnosis of attributes of justice, which focus particularly recently on access to justice. Thank you. One way of approaching these is to consider them confusing and contradictory. Another way is to see them as complementary. So you can see the move from good governance down to rule of law to justice system to access to justice. However, that does not solve the problem. Yeah, thank you. Thus, to take Malawi, if you take the World Bank Governance Index for Malawi, what you see is, in a sense, this framework of complementarity. But we can also observe problems in any such measures. The data seems to suggest that things are getting worse in general, apart from political stability and marginally the rule of law. Is this really true? Can we trust the indicators based largely on qualitatively deeply questionable opinion surveys? Would apparently more objective quantitative indicators do any better? Thank you. A more profound problem, in my view, arises if we take the ABA World Justice Rule of Law Index of Accountability, laws including liberal personal property rights, fair and efficient administration, competent legal officials. This all seems good. But if we take this and look at the situation in South Africa in relation to access to medicines in the HIV/AIDS crisis, we could see that South Africa is a paradigm rule of law country. Okay? So what went wrong? The real problem was the elephant in the room. The global property rights system, part of the rule of law, was such that it produces injustice. And it was only mass protest for change that we have an attempt to deal with this injustice. Thank you. So a lot depends on methodologies. And just briefly, if you can see the left and the right examples, one on the left is very quantitative measuring of access to justice in terms of numbers of courts, etc. On the right is a very subjective indicators of percentages of citizens who say what they think, etc. So is one system better than the other? Thank you. These critiques of indicators may be having some effect. Methodologies are changing. Therefore, for example, the justice for the poor approach of the World Bank and the UNDP's justice for all are both moving away from emphasis on formal to informal systems with much greater emphasis on ethnographic studies. In a very interesting discussion paper, Sage and Woolcock of the World Bank would go even further in promoting grounded approaches with anthropological sensibility which move away from one-size-fits-all approaches to indicators. Yet even interesting, innovative approaches, such as the UNDP's Justice for All, tend to be so much focused on institutional measures. So normative framework, legal awareness, on to satisfactory remedies obtained. Instead, people such, the Rolex project in the Netherlands, for example, they suggest much greater role for the actual user. The user identifies the justice problem. They select the forum. They are essentially motoring towards the actual result. So they're very different approaches. And in some ways, what we can see is that the second approach is coming into fruition. Will these changes make a difference? These are Africans watching. They are actually watching the Gakaka courts, but they are metaphor for the future. I also thought a homage for our chairman who's involved in these court systems. Thank you. So if you look at another way of approaching the whole process, I would like to start with Poggy, who suggests, he promotes a human right against impoverishment, and defines the issue as that of our own personal involvement as supporters and beneficiaries of a global institutional order that substantially contributes to their people's destitution. Frost would say very similarly, that it is the gaze. It is the gaze from which we approach. That philosophical discourses about global justice have to start from and respond to the reality of global injustice. Thank you. Bakshi also says basically that we shouldn't start with the concept of poverty, we should start with the concept of impoverishment. We shouldn't take human rights for granted as apple pie and motherhood. We should deconstruct human rights. In particular, he objects to what he calls trade-related, market-friendly concepts of human rights. Okay, thank you. So an opposite perspective is presented by, for example, Boaventura de Sousa Santos. He would say, in looking at justices and injustices, we should have a subaltern perspective. And the subaltern, in a sense, is specifically different because the subaltern is built in with an activist perspective. Yeah? It is the activist citizen working to struggle for their rights. Thank you. So I come to the Lekani Khazam Banja Club. This is the victim support group of Malawi. The drunkard father who is violent to his wife and children, who do you have recourse to? She goes first to the family and elders. They don't deal with it. Okay? She doesn't want to go to the police because that would be notoriety, the law. We don't want to do it. Okay? So you go to an informal institution, but it's a new institution. It's not tradition in the chief's type of way. It is a victim support group run by women. And the women don't go and hold a hearing. What they do is they go and counsel the bloke and say, they actually counsel him continuously, okay, and say, you must behave yourself, okay, or else. And he does else. And this is my students who reported this, that it's, you know, they're living happily ever after. Maybe, maybe not. But the example is important because it's an example of people taking charge of their lives in a new way. It's not an old traditional way, in a new way. Last slide, please. So the question, good news from Africa. In one sense, what we can see in the study of indicators and looking at justice is a kind of coalescence of things. Yeah? On the one hand, you've got, as I said, a move towards a greater ethnographic methodology, the recognition of pluralism, as the Gakaka quotes, for example, the role of non-state organizations such as the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the AfriMap project, okay, the development of local researchers committed to social justice, the growth of what I would call the subaltern, counter-hegemonic approaches at the intellectual level, such as the Third World approaches to international law, the World Social Forum, the Santos organized counter-hegemonic network. So all these, in one sense, are positive. And if you look at the 50 years, perhaps, this is a good news. On the other hand, we have, we have to look at the contradictions which are involved in these apparently good news systems. And one way is to look at it in terms of, everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. On the other hand, we tend to ignore in these issues the questions of balances of power. And so are we talking here about power and discipline being exercised on the people through indicators? Or are we talking about counter-hegemonic powers which are going to claim? And in this respect, the underlying issue is the issue of, and this is the good news in a sense, people, Africans, seizing the future for themselves. And it is, ultimately, is the ordinary Africans of the Lakhani Club that I would look to. Thank you.
Professor Oyewumi.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, although I heard about this conference late.
Friday.
But it's wonderful. It's a wonderful conference, especially given all those really energetic and interesting dialogue going on. So it's a wonderful conference to be at. And I heard about it late, but I'm happy to be here. And I have to say that my work in general has been on gender, questions of gender, culture, and knowledge in Africa. And I've, of course, also been interested in politics, because as somebody who works on gender, and if I dare say so, as a feminist, we want to transform Africa, and we're doing it. So just like Professor Rothberg, I believe that there's nothing bigger than issues of governance and leadership in Africa. And I think that the division of labor in this conference has sort of left out government and politics, so that when we talk about entrepreneurs, I keep thinking, but the government provides a certain framework of enabling or disabling people in terms of what they have to do. So I'm happy now we're talking about governance and leadership. Okay, the title of my presentation, I'd like to name things, is Rebranding the Continent, African Women as the Leading Brand. And of course, that title highlights what I consider inarguably, and you can challenge me on that, the hottest in the sense of cool and positive trend in African affairs is the emergence of more women, women's participation in politics, and the emergence of women's leadership in many countries on the continent. I see it as an upward trend. I see that there will be no going back. And in 50 years, I dare to imagine what we're going to see on the continent. So what are some of the details or ramifications of this trend? We see an upward trend in women's participation in politics. We see women in increasing leadership roles. We see a deepening of democracy and the rule of law in many countries, not in all countries. Not in mine. Nigeria. Okay? Those Nigerians, yes. We see a building of democratic institutions heralding better access and representation for women and indeed other marginalized groups. And most importantly, an increasing drive by citizens to hold government accountable, because if we're going to have good governance, or whatever good governance is, it has to do with accountability to the voters. There are many countries today, and I don't want to start on Nigeria, in which the government and the voters don't meet, not even at elections, which is another story. As Gretchen Bauer and Hannah Britton said in their book on African parliaments, they point out the fact that in the last decade or so, there has been a number of countries in Africa in which women have emerged, and the representation of women in the legislatures, in the parliaments, have gone beyond 30%. And of course, due to Timothy Longman's work on Rwanda and others, we've seen that Rwanda now is the country in the world that has the highest number of women representatives of any parliament, of any legislature in the world. And this is radical. If you've ever paid attention to what African women represented in the global world, some of the most negative images of Africa and that terrible viewing of Africa as a basket case, as a charity case, one of the ways in which such an image of Africa is achieved is actually through African women. African women as victims, African women as beasts of burden, African women as charity cases. That's what we keep saying. And what that has illustrated, really, in discussions of Africa in the globe is the failure of Africa. So you have to appreciate the fact that today, in feminist circles, in gender circles, the fact that African women are now at the vanguard of showing the world, including places like the United States, really, strategies and experiences of how to get more women into government and more women's representation in government. And government is big. Government is important because so many things depend on the government. Yes, we want entrepreneurs, we want the private sector to take care of things, but you have to provide a framework of laws. You have to make policy. And the government is important in doing this. So it has become even ever more important to get African women in there so that African women, too, can be part of policy determination. So we have at least about 6-7 countries have been identified. Rwanda is one of them. South Africa, Mozambique, Seychelles, Uganda, Namibia, and Rwanda all have more than 30% female representation in their lawmaking bodies. It is interesting that the phenomenon initially seemed to be more associated with post-conflict societies in East and Southern Africa. And we have to ask the question why, but I'll not dwell on that right now. But more recently, the entrance of West Africa into this pantheon of countries in which women are making strides and claiming power in order to transform society is the entrance of Liberia into this pantheon of what I might call the anointed countries. And indeed, in the case of Liberia, it has been even more dramatic because this attainment of power by an African woman went beyond the legislature. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a.k.a. my Ellen, claimed the presidency of Liberia and was sworn in January of 2006. Sirleaf's victory and assumption of the presidency of Liberia is in a class by itself because it has increased our range as African women. In fact, these days when you say, you know, African women, you say from beast of burden to president. Then nobody needs to tell you, you have to think again. In the past, it's beast of burden, but beast of burden to president. So what are you talking about? So the presence of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has increased our range as African women, even in terms of just visualizing it. We can talk about role modeling, but most importantly, this is also about power. It is also about power, and I, for one, am happy that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is running again. But most importantly, I don't want to base this on just one person. Because what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's victory in Liberia represents is not the victory of one person. Because if we focus on Liberia, what we see is that her emergence and her victory was actually based on the work and the support of women. There's no question. In fact, I, as a gender scholar, find Liberia extremely fascinating because of the way in which the emergence of the female leader is quite fused with the grassroots movement. A grassroots movement that is so conscious of itself. If not as feminists, but as a women's group that has particular interests. So it's an unfolding situation. It's a very interesting situation, not only for Liberia, not only for Africa, but for all of us to watch and see the lessons that we can learn. How many people have seen that film, Praying the Devil Back to Hell? Gosh, if you haven't seen it, you have to see it. I'll talk about the film in a minute, but to underscore the fact that Sirleaf is not a one-star, one-woman show, let me read a quote here from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's inaugural speech. And I quote, "And now I would like to talk to the women of Liberia, the women of Africa, and the women of the world. Until a few decades ago, Liberian women endured the injustice of being treated as second-class citizens. During the years of our civil war, they bore the brunt of inhumanity and terror. They were conscripted into war, raped at will, and forced into domestic slavery." And then she goes on. "It is therefore not surprising that during the period of our elections, Liberian women were galvanized and demonstrated unmatched passion, enthusiasm, and support for my candidacy. They stood with me, they defended me, they prayed for me. The same can be said of women throughout Africa." And then she went on to say, "My administration shall thus endeavor to give Liberian women prominence in all affairs of the country. My administration shall empower Liberian women in all areas of national life, and we will enforce the law without fear or favor." The point of all this is to show that indeed, in the particular case of Liberia, voters, especially these women voters, were able to put a leader in place, a leader that they supported, and so that in that case, their votes counted for something. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf herself has responded that Liberian women are her main constituency, and she's going to respond to them. This is not a referendum on what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is doing. I can't speak to that at this moment, but it seems to me that it is important that you had a group of women, the women's movement in Liberia, continuing the work that they had started with peace building, because indeed, what the story of Liberia tells us is that the Liberian women's movement organized itself and challenged President Taylor to meet with the opposition leader after 14 years of war. And when you listen to the women, they talked about the fact that we were tired of war, and they risked their life in challenging the government to put an end to this war. So it's a very interesting story of indeed ordinary people, ordinary women. And these are ordinary women. These are ordinary women, the so-called market women, or what I call mother entrepreneurs, who got together and challenged the government. So it is from this history of peace building that their consciousness, their experiences, and their work developed to the extent that they were able to elect a leader. But as I said, in West Africa, they represent a very particular example, because most of the examples of the countries where you've seen women's participation and women's representation are in East and Southern Africa. So the question is why? Because I think we have to ask the question of why it is that it is these countries that I have touched upon that are the ones who have high participation rates of women in parliament, in government, and you see a trend towards institutionalization and all that. And part of the reason why, of course, one is interested in trying to understand why these wonderful developments are taking place in these places is what we can learn from them and whether we can patent it across the continent. We actually need that in Nigeria. So let me go through quickly some of the reasons why these movements and indeed these trends are emerging in these particular places. And I'm talking of Namibia, South Africa, Liberia, Uganda, and the like. And so this development of women's participation and ordinary women's being engaged in government and consciousness and accountability has to do with the fact that these societies have been called post-conflict societies, and whether it's Namibia or South Africa or Liberia or even Rwanda, they've gone through very traumatic periods, civil war, genocide. And so one of the questions that immediately arises, of course, is that do we have to go through a genocide or have a 14-year war in Nigeria? We've had a civil war. Why didn't it give rise to more positive trends, right? So, of course, these things are associated with post-conflict societies. Yes, post-conflict. And some of the ideas about why post-conflict societies, especially in Africa at this time, would generate what has turned out to be a positive trend has to do with the fact that, of course, post-conflict societies offer significant avenues for change. Indeed, post-conflict periods are periods of change, periods of transformation, and periods of opportunity in which people are trying to put new things in place. Another reason that has been adduced for this positive trend is that during the periods of conflict, whether we're talking about South Africa, Namibia, or Liberia, indeed, women didn't just emerge in one day. They were involved in the South African liberation movement. They were involved in the Namibian liberation movement. In the case of Liberia, they were involved in the peace movement. And indeed, some of them had been recruited. And that through these processes of conflict and violence, certain cadres of women emerged out of those experiences, very capable and indeed ready to go into politics. And then, of course, there's also the idea that women were emboldened by these struggles and so inserted themselves into the constitution writing, and indeed articulating themselves as a group so that in the process of constitution writing, inserting women in, pushing for certain kinds of legislation and quotas for women. And then, of course, you also had, in the last 2 decades, some of which came out of the United Nations organizing, a lot of women's organizations, NGOs, and part of what that has also wrought is that it is within NGOs and civil societies that a lot of leadership of women who then go into politics emerge. And then, of course, we also can talk about the global women's movement and the degree to which women in different parts of the world continue to influence each other and learn from each other and actually look at blueprints from different places. And so I expect that in Nigeria, for example, or in some other African countries, we will all be looking at different countries. South Africa, how did they do it? What did they do? What sort of pressure did they put? And finally, I think that part of what the presence of women in legislatures and indeed in the executive branch in quite a number of African countries, what it also then represents is the fact that the idea that women should not be leaders is totally out of the picture, indeed. And I can see that in a place like Nigeria, people are embarrassed that Liberia has a female president already, and they don't seem to get it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our presenters. I think we had 3 great presentations that should lead to a lot of discussion. Professor Rotberg has to leave at 3:30, so I'm going to use the discretion of the chair and see if there are a few questions specifically for him that we could start with, and then we'll open up for more general discussions. So I see one hand here, and one back there, and one over here. So let's start here.
Thank you very much. Professor Rotberg, your index on African governance seems to be focused on individual states as distinct entities, but I wonder if you could say more about the relations between the states, and in particular, some of the examples you cited. Seems like, I wonder if Rwanda enjoys a ranking in the middle area, in the 20s, because Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, is consigned to the lower depths. I suppose the question is, how much of Rwanda as a success story is related to the destabilization and pillage of the Eastern Congo? These are not discrete, unrelated facts, I think. Thank you very much.
Yes. You have mentioned about Singapore experience and Ghana and others, and I've seen that quite a lot being made. I've always wondered, have we been always fair about how we assess progress of Africa, in the sense that Singapore at that time also had 5 years of education on average, compared to Ghana, which had 1 year. So Singapore was a much more educated society at that time, yet we say human capital is at the center of it. And in general, if you look at African leadership at that time, if you talk of, like, for example, like Congo, country the size of Western Europe, with 3 university graduates, with only about 3 people in the civil service, almost nothing. African countries started with almost 0 capacity. So how far we have reached? Can't we say that we have done quite well? It's like you got a bus and people who couldn't drive, and they have driven somewhere, even if they have had accidents, they have moved. So can't we just be a bit more fair in the way we assess Africa performance, given the circumstances they found themselves in?
My question also follows the regional trend question. In terms of the trends you see, I had the opportunity to project the governance index onto a map of Africa, and you see clear spatial relationships. And I'm wondering, how much should we read into those trends? And if you look at stability of countries, those relationships that we see, can we envision isolated states just making a jump up the rankings without the whole region also doing the same?
One more question here, and then we'll let Professor Rupert respond.
I think we all agree with what you said as far as good leadership for economic development or development in general, rule of law. You mentioned about 10 countries relating to good development and good leadership, and also Zimbabwe, and I think another country also, Nigeria. You mentioned basically where there is injustice. I'm sorry, not where there is injustice. I wonder why you missed Ethiopia, and I want to know your opinion as far as Ethiopia. You probably know, and I'm not really want to tell you that it's a really minority government. It's been in power for over 18 years. You know about the 2005 election. It's really a minority government. As far as the military leadership is concerned, it's almost like 99.9% of the generals.
Stop you to make sure he has time to respond.
Okay,
so the question
fine.
was, what
the
about
question
Ethiopia?
is, why did you miss Ethiopia?
The last question is very easy. I'll answer that first. Ethiopia wasn't missed. It just ranks 37th in the 2009 index. So a lot of one's concerns about Ethiopia are reflected in the number, 37 out of the full continent. And not as low as Eritrea, but lower than many other countries. In fact, if I go back quickly, in this 2009 index, which reflects somewhat older data and reflects the 2005 election and so on, Ethiopia is below Guinea-Bissau. Now, subsequently, we might not have put that, but curiously, Guinea-Bissau probably benefits from having a higher GDP per capita than Ethiopia, and also, as you know better than I, Ethiopia has some of the poorest infrastructure in the continent. Let's go back to an earlier question, because it missed some of the benefits of infrastructure because it lacked colonial rule for the most part, whereas Namibia, as the ambassador said, benefited from that. Now, some of the other questions, if I may. The Rwanda, yes, Rwanda probably has benefited from the extraction of resources from Congo, but Rwanda also ranks as high as it does because of greatly improving leadership, rule of law, safety and security in Rwanda, particularly in Kigali, is very high, which is a leadership factor and a not an institutional matter. And I think Rwanda's number, about 26, whether it's 20th or 30th, it probably is about right. But it's what's useful diagnostically is to look at some of these numbers, not as 26 is better than 27, but that 26 puts it in a relationship to its neighbors, which is interesting and worth parsing out. When Rwanda brought me there a year ago to explain why Rwanda was doing so well and how it could improve, there was an enormous dispute in the all-day seminar about Rwanda's very low rankings on freedom of the media. And the index bases its freedom of the media on the Committee to Protect Journalists based in Paris. And that wasn't good enough for the government, of course, which claimed to have absolute freedom of the media, which is nonsense. And we went back and forth on things like that. But that was one of the areas where it's clear that President Kagame was persuaded to think about the possibility of relaxing some of the strictures on the media. So the diagnostic capability is perhaps useful. Julius, they're true that there are resource issues, but to take Singapore as an extreme example, Singapore, most of Africa didn't have Chinese triad gangs and the immense corruption that Singapore had before '65. So in many ways, and particularly with the per capita income, Ghana, Nigeria in the 60s, much wealthier places, better run places than Singapore. So the point of focusing on Singapore is simply to emphasize the importance that governance has played in shifting the balance of power to Asia from Africa. It could have been otherwise. And we can go into not the colonial past, although that has a major role, but the decisions made by leaders. One thing I always say about leadership and about failed states is that no state in Africa fails itself. States like Congo and Sudan and Sierra Leone and Liberia, pre-Kennedy School graduates, were failed by human agency. We have to look at the role that Shaka Stevens played. We have to look at the role of Taylor, obviously. That will come out in the court proceedings. We have to look at the various military rulers of Nigeria. We have to look at the 14 billion that Mobutu secreted away in Switzerland. We also have to look at CAR, Amin, and so on, and even at the terrible period in Kenya of Arap Moi. Leadership played an enormous role in all these problems we're talking about. And of course, Zimbabwe, where I've spent so much time trying to and failing to turn Mugabe around. It's quite clear the difference between Mugabe 1, which was 1980, 1995, and Mugabe 2, which is 1995 to date. And the dramatic difference, because Zimbabwe, as the ambassador knows, and many in this room may know, had the best balanced economy per capita in Africa, plus the most educated population per capita in Africa until Mugabe destroyed it. So human agency is critical. Yes, the region. I think nation states are an important category because that's how people think of themselves, as living within nation states. And yes, the regional problems impinge, but Niger's recent trajectory doesn't depend and didn't depend on what Nigeria did. What happens in Chad is influenced by what happens in the Sudan, but it's also greatly influenced by leadership factors in Chad and also petroleum. One other point one should mention in all of this that perhaps hasn't come out is two things, if I may. One is that the resource curse has been more important in Africa than any other part of the world in recent decades. And the only place that's escaped, well, the only two places, is really Botswana and Namibia for leadership reasons. Secondly, I didn't get a chance earlier, and I need to say just one word about the importance of China in all these questions in the next decade and more. China has the potential to transform Africa in ways that the West could never have dreamed about. But the critical element and the ethical question that was raised earlier is absolutely right. The human rights question is a more important thing. China's supporting Sudan and supporting Zimbabwe. China is exporting agricultural produce from Zimbabwe, which was desperately poor, to China every day. There are Chinese farming in Bangkok near the president's home area, and these are leased lands that have been given to the Chinese of all things, and the Chinese employ only Chinese in most cases. Now, so China is critical, but it's up to Africa to control China, not anybody else. It's up to multilateral African leaders to really deal with, not on a country-by-country basis. Thank you.
So, Adel, the conference next year is China and Africa, I'm seeing. So, well, exactly. So you bring the two conferences together, and we have. So if we could take 3 or 4 questions again and make them pretty concise, because then Professor Rotenberg might have a chance to, but address questions to any of the panel members, please. Yes, let's take one here, one there, one there, one. Okay, sure. So let's start over there. Melissa.
Thank you. My question's for Professor Oyewumi. And your enthusiasm was infectious. But I was wondering are you excited about women in leadership positions because they're women or because they're new? They're new leaders in the sense that they're coming into their own and they're taking over these positions. And I wonder if we could think back to the late 1950s or early 1960s as independence was sweeping across Africa. Were these the same kinds of conversations that people were having about African men? And that the idea was that leadership was going to change because as British, Belgian, German, Portuguese rulers left and African men took these positions, there was going to be something qualitatively different about their rule. Do we expect for something to be qualitatively different about women taking over these positions?
Yeah. Oh, well, okay, we'll start
my quick question. One, when we talk about politics and institutions in Africa, what really is the role of external factors in the stability of this nation as it is today? Because we know and we've all identified the solution when it comes to the internal issues. However, how strong is the role of the external issues when it comes to conflict and when it comes to politics? And going forward for Africa, of course, with the introduction of China, what is the future, and is there any way to address this? Then secondly, I also want to talk about, ask another question, and this is, basically, we know that politics is important to economic growth and entrepreneurship and etc. But does the country or continent become paralyzed because of the challenges of politics right now? I mean, will there be no way forward unless we fix the politics? Or can we continue to trust that entrepreneurship can bring innovation despite the political challenges?
Okay, we'll take one here in the middle and then come back over to this side.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
Hello. My question is also somewhat related to women's issues, which is that in a number of countries, including Senegal, for example, you have the beginnings of ministries of women's issues or women's ministries in general. And I was just kind of wondering, and this is open to anyone, whether or not you find this is a beneficial move or if it has somewhat of a marginalizing effect.
So let's have you and then the ambassador and then Professor Oyewumi, and then we'll go to some answers.
Yes, Dr. Oyewumi, I was struck by the irony of the fact that there are more women in the Rwandan legislature than any other country in Africa. And yet, it's right next...
In the world.
In the world.
Yeah.
Okay, in the world. Even more ironic. That it's
54% now.
Borders on the eastern Congo where the oppression of women and, murder and rape has reached unprecedented levels in perhaps modern history. Do you see any hope for the eastern Congo and the fact that women are playing such an important role in Rwanda, especially given Rwanda's perhaps negative role in the Congo, in the extractive industries?
The ambassador?
Yes, thank you. I was left, but
yes, I had a
we can talk about him in his absence.
Yes, but well, first of all, was really his question of his concept of leadership, because I could see the big man syndrome behind the concept of leadership. And I think as you look at the panelists, we have the, what you call the counter-hegemonic power, which is the different institutions that are emerging in Africa. And that is transforming Africa. And because, unlike some particular country where where the title president was only reserved for the heads of state. You couldn't be a president of a football club or a president of anything else. The president was only reserved for the heads of state. And that shows, But since then, it has changed. So leadership is not only about government, and that's, but it's also about different kind of institutions. The private sector is becoming a very important player. And that's why these three presentations sort of complemented each other very well. But I wanted to take up issue on this, the big man syndrome, because I think they are the one basically who have failed Africa. And if we say, if you find a good big man, then things will be okay. But maybe it's a structure. But also the discussion now in Africa is that we have moved from this charismatic leadership, where you had the Nyerere, the Nkrumahs, who were mobilizing everybody to run after them, to a more technocratic, where people are now independent, not just to be mobilized to run into things, but they can do things for themselves in the local communities, etc. And therefore, the counter-hegemonic paradigm is important. And that takes me to the next issue, and that is gender fall into that category. But maybe to be a devil's advocate, you know, we used to ask, would you rather be a white woman or a black man in apartheid South Africa?
What does that have to do with anything?
It has to do a lot. It has a lot to do with that. But let me come.
Explain yourself.
Yes. No, I will. But you don't have to answer that. It's rhetorical.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. Then.
But the fact that you thought it in the first place.
Yes. The second question, the second of this one was P.W. Botha, former president of South Africa. He meets his old friend from then Rhodesia, and they were at school together, and he asked him, so what are you doing? He asked this old friend of his, and his old friend said, no, I'm a big businessman, I'm running this, and I own that and that. And then the friend asked him, and what are you doing now? And he said, don't you read newspapers? Or listen to the radio? I'm the president of South Africa. And he said, oh, in my country, you know, that is for the blacks now. The presidency. It's not for white men. Now, and this is now what happens with the question of economic empowerment when it comes to gender. We see this advance into political offices. And in Namibia now, we have moved beyond looking at that. We are looking now at women in business, in management in the private sector, because that's where the actual empowerment is going to take. Not that politics is insignificant, but also there is, you know, the power is shifting now. And there are issues to be dealt with. That's why Africa, one shouldn't generalize. But, you know, the power is shifting now, and now these are the economic issues. And women are said, well, we have been given political power. Everybody is moving away from politics, and the real power is in economics. And we're left behind there. Now.
So if you can.
Yes. Okay.
Wrap up and let them.
Yes.
That's where
okay.
I see Adil looking very nervous over there.
No, that's fine. The next question was really the transformative power of women. They come into office, and what does it mean in terms of, you know, the quality of leadership and other things? And but there's no time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you made your point.
Perhaps we can start with Professor Paliwala, yes. And then we'll, since a number of the questions were directed towards
leadership. I think that's a very significant issue, and I take the African leadership in the contemporary situation has actually developed a huge level of complexity, because on the one hand you have the leaders like Mugabe, who are very strong men and who've got, in some ways, they're trapped in their own system. You know, they're not, the Mugabe of 1980s and the Mugabe of today are different, partly because they are controlled by very different forces, in my view. But the other aspect of it is that we have got leaders in Africa who also are losing control to the global. They don't actually lead their own country, because all the time the system of leadership is such that you are accountable all the time to global influences, and accountable almost in the minutiae of detail. You know, it's a kind of a disciplinary detail which has become very important in a system. So where does genuine leadership, which we all want, where can it come from, where can it flourish, becomes a very, very difficult issue. Yeah.
So I think there were about 10 questions for...
Oh, there are 10 questions? Okay, I don't know that there are 10, but you will have to remind me. But it seems to me that people are concerned about the impact that women would have in leadership positions. And one person pointedly asked me, am I excited about women's presence in politics and in positions of leadership in these countries because they're new? Or is it because they're women and I expect that certain things inherently will come out of women being in that position? I want to say that these societies, these governments that we run across the world today are supposed to be democracies, right? That's the ideal, democracy. And what does democracy mean? Inclusion. So it doesn't matter to me. I think at a certain level, the fact that women or democracy expands to include as many of the citizens as possible is a good thing in and of itself. And we cannot overstate that. So it is from that perspective, in the first instance, that I begin to look and get excited about the fact that African women in these countries, in particular, are emerging into these positions. That's one thing. The other question, do we expect then that because these are women, the quality of leadership would change? The jury is out on that. And as a gender scholar who does not necessarily believe in the inherent nature of women or men, I think that what we need to focus on are the experiences. And when you look at these 6, 7, 8 countries, South Africa, Namibia, Rwanda, Uganda, there are 3, 4, 5, 6 trajectories that these women's groups and women leaders have followed to get into power. So it's not the same story all over. So it's not one thing. And those who have focused on it and have written about it, and Tim is an expert on this because he studied Rwanda, present all sorts of scenarios and experiences and lessons to distill from how South African women got into positions of power and how in South Africa, the women's groups, there was a coalition of women's groups, and they were able to write what they call the Women's Charter. So indeed, in terms of laws, there are very many progressive legislations that have to do with gender, that has to do with being gay. South Africa is supposed to have the most progressive constitution, okay? So we can talk about all those positive things going on in South Africa. But on the other hand, especially when you are talking about gender issues, we also see that South African society is a very difficult place for ordinary women. The whole question of rape, the whole question of lack of access to health, these are the kinds of questions that come up when you look at South Africa. Why I am particularly excited about Liberia is actually the way in which people's votes counted. And maybe I'm really reacting to this because I am a Nigerian. In Nigeria, people vote, the election goes the other way, period. And so, and it's not only that, the degree to which the Liberian women's movement is engaged on a daily basis, and the continuing engagement of women with the political system, with the government, and with the executive, to the extent that today in Liberia, they set up special courts to deal with sexual assault. Special courts to fast-track sexual assault, and of course to provide, anonymity, because so many women, when they are raped, and rape is a big problem still in Liberia. And a lot of women's organizations are advocating and pushing the government. So indeed, part of what I see when I look at this issue of women's participation or democracy in general is the degree to which it involves work for the citizens. Because for government to be responsive, right, you have to have constituencies, people to continue to push them. So what I keep thinking about, how do we do that? How do we replicate that? How do we maintain that kind of creating constituencies, movements to make our governments accountable? And what I see in these countries is that that's part of what they're doing. And then I want to respond to the gentleman here who was talking. I mean, even in this country today, maybe some white people say, oh, well, you know, we don't do that anymore. It's black people who are in the presidency, right? Why not? And then, you know, the kind of argument you make is the kind of argument that was made in this country maybe 2 decades ago when black mayors started taking over the big cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York. It was like, well, you know, white people have left it alone. It means that there's no power in it. Go talk to Bloomberg about that in New York City. So the idea that men are moving away from politics, maybe Namibia. I mean, Nigerian women have a long history of being in the business world, highly educated, but in terms of politics, we're not as well represented. So in a certain sense, it's the opposite of Namibia. So in a sense, the whole idea that men would leave politics, the state is too important to be left to only men, only women, or only anybody. We all have to be engaged with the state. And so the idea that, well, we can leave the state alone, leave politics alone, and pursue entrepreneurship, people can do all those things. But it is under the auspices of the state that anything goes on. And so when I hear this argument that we'll leave the state alone, the NGOs can do this, it recalls what has happened in Africa in the last 25, 30 years. An impetus coming from the West, the whole idea that African governments are so corrupt, so we're just going to fund the NGOs. It's like, how is it that everywhere else there's a government and the state is important, and in Africa you think we can bypass the state? But what it talks about is the degree to which African countries are so vulnerable and continue to be externally determined. And so we need to deal with the state and organize to create states that are accountable to voters. And so my excitement about this, the presence of women, is the expansion, the inclusiveness of democracy, and that maybe truly we can have democratic systems in which we can transform many of our countries which do need transformation, and that the ones that are on track, that they'll continue to maintain it and deepen that, the deepening of democracy, and that in 50 years' time will be at another level.
Well, thank you to our panelists for a great panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
How long are we taking?